Hello and welcome to the Yolo County District Attorney's Office podcast series, The Chronicles of Justice. Today's episode will cover the topic of human trafficking. January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so it's timely to share some of the ways that the Yolo County District Attorney will do their part in combating what has been named as one of the world's fastest growing criminal enterprises. My name is Wendy Wilcox, and I'm joined today by Deputy District Attorney Tiffany Susz and Yolo County District Attorney Investigator Jennifer Davis, who are both assigned to handling human trafficking cases within our office. Tiffany, as we get started, I must admit that the first time that I heard the term human trafficking, I imagined that it meant the act of human smuggling, or bringing a hidden, undocumented human across the border into another country on their own accord.
Wendy, that's not the first time that I've heard that. When I talk to people about human trafficking, the typical response I get is what you just said to me. Or people will say things along the lines of, oh, that's terrible when you hear about children being brought from other countries to our country, or children in those countries being required to perform horrific sex acts. People often think of it as an international issue, and it absolutely can be. But what we're here today to talk about is human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, and that it is a domestic problem. And to have people understand that this is something that's been going on for a very long time in our country, that what we were calling it was prostitution. What we were calling who we now see as victims, we were calling them prostitutes. And what we have going on in Yolo County and in California and in the United States is a sex trafficking problem. To understand how this is a domestic issue, I think it's important for the public to understand, and I think a lot of Californians don't know, that California is a top 4 destination state. What I mean when I say that is that this is one of the most desirable places where traffickers bring their victims, minors and adults, to force minors and adults to commit sex acts. In California, 72% of our sex trafficking victims are born in the United States. To address the confusion that you mentioned, Wendy, about smuggling compared to human trafficking, I think most Californians and most Americans don't recognize that the percentage is so high of victims that are being trafficked. And what I also think a lot of Californians and Americans don't recognize is that these victims are juveniles. These victims are adults that are being forced by someone else to commit sex acts.
What types of crimes are we seeing here in Yolo County?
We are seeing what the rest of the nation is seeing and what other counties in the state of California are seeing, which is human trafficking. We're seeing human trafficking of minors. We're seeing human trafficking of adults. I think that, again, when you're talking to the public about sex trafficking and you're talking about minors being sex trafficked and minors that are being required to commit acts of prostitution by a trafficker, I think your average person in the community can understand how a minor could be manipulated. So for that reason, when you're prosecuting these types of cases or investigating these cases, you're not required to prove any deprivation of liberty. Basically, if a trafficker is requiring a minor to engage in sex acts, that they're encouraging that minor in any way, whether that be posting ads online on internet escort websites or driving a minor to a date with a John to commit a sex act, that is pandering. If the trafficker is gaining any benefit from the minor engaging in acts of prostitution, the trafficker is pimping that minor. How I explain facilitating or encouraging to people is typically explaining what we see happen in most cases, which is that this trafficker may post this minor on an internet escort website advertising sexual services. Or if that trafficker drives the minor to a location where that minor engages in some type of sex act with a John, that's human trafficking. In those situations, it's the trafficker that's controlling everything. The trafficker is controlling how the dates are set up, taking that minor to the date. The challenges that law enforcement face when they contact this minor is that that minor may say that they did all of this, that they were the ones that posted the ads, that they don't have a trafficker. But consent's not a defense to the human trafficking of a minor. The challenge becomes, in this area, is trying to prove human trafficking involving an adult victim. The additional requirement that we have to prove when we have an adult victim is that that victim's liberty has been deprived. And this can be challenging when you have a victim that is denying any culpability on the part of her pimp. The way that we have to prove deprivation of personal liberty involving an adult victim is to try to understand the relationship that that victim has with the trafficker. But it's not just understanding the current relationship, it's trying to understand that victim's past relationship. So when we're talking about the deprivation of personal liberty with an adult victim, you have to understand, how did that adult get started in this life? And oftentimes what we're seeing is that they got started as a minor. It's important for anyone dealing with this particular population to understand their story, because you can bet their trafficker knows their story. They know exactly what this victim's particular vulnerabilities are and how to exploit those vulnerabilities.
Investigator Davis, how does local law enforcement investigate these cases in Yolo County to determine if you have human trafficking, pimping, or pandering violation?
Well, there has been a shift on how these cases have been handled. In the past, people involved in acts of prostitution may have been treated as a suspect by law enforcement. But now, with increased awareness of the culture of pimping and human trafficking, law enforcement has changed that approach to what is known as victim-centered approach. This removes the label of suspect or prostitute, and law enforcement now begins a dialogue with this person about their life and their relationships. They do this to determine whether there may be more to the story, such as a trafficker who they may even call their boyfriend, which is common in our cases that we see. This is often the boyfriend that they call is the one person that calls the shots, sets up the dates, collects the money, and tells the person what to do. All of this information is important and useful when conducting our investigations so that we're complete and thorough. Once the victim is contacted and identified or suspected of being a victim, an advocate is offered to provide services to assist the victim throughout this process. Interviewing sex trafficking victims can be particularly challenging for investigators, given the trauma endured by the victim, the relationship between the victim and the offender, as Tiffany's already mentioned, and the victim's vulnerabilities to continued exploitation in their future.
Tiffany, does that present challenges when you take these kind of cases to trial?
When going to trial, it's necessary to have expert testimony about the life. When I talk about the life, I'm talking about the culture of pimping, pandering, and human trafficking. This is something I had to become educated on before I could even understand the dynamics in these cases. So you could imagine people that don't have any background, that are sitting as jurors in these particular cases, are asking questions with an adult victim. Well, why would she stay with this person? Because there's varying levels of control that these traffickers may have. And depending upon who that particular victim is, what that trafficker may be holding over their head, or how long they've been with that trafficker. So you can have situations where your victim may be able to come and go from the motel room, where the trafficker lets her set up her own dates. But if he knows that she's going to follow whatever he says, because she knows what's going to happen if she doesn't follow what he says. Jurors may think that the victim chooses to do this, or this is something that they want to do. And one of the reasons that they may think that is because that's exactly what your victim has told law enforcement, and that's what your victim's saying when they're testifying at trial. But it's important to have experts to come in and testify why the victim may be saying that, what they see about the life, that they may be scared. It's important for jurors to hear from experts like Investigator Davis, who's familiar with this culture, so that jurors can understand why minors or adults would stay with these traffickers.
That's true, Tiffany. On any given day, as we both know, here in Yolo County, there are advertisements posted for sex on the internet. Some of these girls are very young. There's a demand in our county, and as long as there is a demand here, then the supply will be here or travel to our location. We are currently working closely with our local law enforcement and surrounding agencies to better serve our victims and successfully prosecute these cases. Our office, along with the support of the Yolo County Board of Supervisors, is committed to combat human trafficking within our county.
Thank you, Tiffany and Jennifer. I think President Barack Obama's quote about human trafficking said it best.
It ought to concern every person because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime. I'm talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery.
In conclusion, I'd like to remind the public to be aware of their surroundings, to be diligent in reporting these types of crimes. Recently in Elk Grove, California, for instance, an Uber driver noticed two women behaving strangely towards a young girl. During their Uber ride, the women were telling the girl what she should do and say with the man she was about to meet at a local motel. The Uber driver reported it to the local law enforcement, and 3 subjects were arrested. Heroic actions such as his can save other victims from being trafficked. The Yolo County District Attorney is dedicated to providing resources and information in an effort to increase public awareness. For more information and resources that may be used to report human trafficking incidents, please visit the designated page on our website, yoloda.org. You may also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.